Good evening, everyone. I am Betsy Fischer Martin, the Executive Director of the Women in Politics Institute at American University. Welcome to another installment of our virtual series, Women on Wednesdays, which we started over the summer, and we are excited to continue this fall as we return to our virtual campus. To those of you new to one of our events, WPI is a nonprofit and nonpartisan institute in AU School Public Affairs that aims to close the gender gap in political leadership. And we offer academic and practical campaign training, and we facilitate research and discussions like this on women in politics. If you joined us last week on Women's Equality Day, you know we kicked off the semester with part one of a special series that we are doing on the discussions on the Suffrage Centennial, exploring our collective history as women in a democracy. And tonight, we turn our attention to Black women and the vote, how the 19th Amendment left far too many disfranchised, and how most Black women would wait nearly 5 decades more to actually be allowed to cast a ballot in this country. The stories of dozens of Black women suffragists beautifully and courageously fill the pages of a terrific new book, Vanguard, how Black women broke barriers, won the vote, and insisted on equality. And we are delighted to be joined by its author, Dr. Martha Jones. Dr. Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and a professor of history at Johns Hopkins University. And we're so excited that she's with us tonight. I want to also let folks know that we are going to save plenty of time for questions. So please do feel free during the course of our discussion to look down at the bottom of the screen, and you'll notice a button that says Ask a Question. So you can ask a question in that box. And if you see other questions that you're interested in, you can upvote those as well. And in the middle of the screen, you'll see a big green button that'll open a new window and a link to pre-order a copy of the book, which actually hits bookstores next Tuesday. So you can get an early copy. It'll be at your door when it hits the bookstore. If you miss any of the discussion and you want to share it with friends, you can replay. A replay will be available right at the link that you use to register. So Martha Jones, thank you, and congratulations on the book.
Well, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So the book looks back at 200 years of African-American women's political history. Give us an overview to start. What did you hope that this book would accomplish, and why do you think it's so important to understand and recognize as part of history, especially at this time?
I started Vanguard well aware that in 2020 we would be marking 100 years of the 19th Amendment. And I was concerned, frankly, that a stock and somewhat hackneyed interpretation that tells a story that goes from Seneca Falls, New York in 1848 in a small meeting of women and some men, and culminates in 1920 with ratification of the 19th Amendment. I was concerned that that story would predominate, knowing, as I do from my field of African American women's history, that there was a great deal more to tell. And I wind up writing a book that covers 200 years, really from 1820 to 2020, which already tells you something about the way in which a focus on African American women led me to a rethinking of the stock narrative. It starts much earlier. I was really interested in women as thinkers. Where did their ideas generate out of? How did they develop a political critique of their standing in American politics? And that took me back to the early decades of the 19th century. And then, well, here we are, right, in 2020, and the recognition, even as I was finishing this book some months ago now, the recognition that voting rights are still in the 21st century a battle, a struggle against many things, including racism and sexism, still in the United States. One of the conclusions out of the book is, in fact, the ways in which voting rights in the U.S., when we take the perspective of African Americans, come into view as really always contested.
Mm-hmm.
That voter suppression is not a creature of simply post 2013 and Shelby County versus Holder, but voter suppression is a companion to the story of voting rights in U.S. history. And that is the story that Vanguard looks to tell. I take the point of view of African American women, and I'm able to do that in part because among academic historians, we have really for 3 generations been recovering, researching, writing, documenting, chronicling African American women's political history. And so there's a great deal in Vanguard that is indebted to those 3 generations of work. And at the same time, I wanted to wrestle forthrightly with the question of what did 1920 actually accomplish for American women, and the story of African American women, their disenfranchisement even after ratification of a federal amendment, really opens a door to thinking about the limits of the 19th Amendment. It guarantees no American woman the vote, not a one, but many more. Some women are better positioned to take advantage of the prohibition against using sex as a voting criteria. Some women are better positioned than others to take advantage of that. Vanguard takes a capacious view of politics. In other words, the vote is the spine of this book, but
Mm-hmm.
writing about Black women made clear to me that there was no way not to tell a fuller story about how women struggle, about the strategies and tactics that they use, and the ways in which their approach to politics is necessarily multifaceted. If Black women had waited for the vote, um, they would have failed to enjoy political power in this country until 1965 and ratification of the Voting Rights Act. But many of the women in Vanguard, if you will, find their ways around the problem of disfranchisement, not wholly or completely, but enough so that we can discern sort of the fullness of their political acumen across 2 centuries. So maybe that's enough, if that's
Yeah.
okay,
And
Betsy, and to
yeah.
get us started. But thank you again. Thank you to the Women in Politics Institute, and it's really an honor to be here for Women on Wednesdays. This
Yeah,
is a
thank
great
you.
series.
Thank you. And we'll spend some time talking about some of those women that did so much during that time period. But I want to start with a woman that you dedicate the book to, Nancy Bell Graves. Tell us about her and how your interest in genealogy set you on the path to write this book.
So can I give away our bond, which is one of the things you and I share is a really keen interest in genealogical research, and in some ways all of my books have emanated out of from the stories of women in my family, not because they all tell precisely their stories, but the questions that I have about their lives have very much inspired my work. Nancy Bell Graves is born in Danville, Kentucky in 1808. She is an enslaved woman there, will win her freedom in 1865 with the Emancipation Proclamation, and go on to raise a family, including 4 daughters, one of them being my great-great-grandmother. I dedicate the book to her in part because it became important for me to, in the early chapters of this book, center as best I could the ideas, the activism, the particular challenges that enslaved women confronted. Their lives, in many ways, serve up for their daughters, their granddaughters, their great-granddaughters, and more, an agenda that includes, for example, the scourge of sexual violence and the role that that has played in the lives of many, many enslaved women, including my great-great-grandmother. So I dedicate this book to her because she inspires her life inspires many of the themes that Vanguard explores. And at the same time, the book is indeed a tribute to women who bequeath to us their own distinct brand of persistence, of grit, of strength, and make it possible for someone like me to come and try and recover this long and complex history of Black women and voting rights. So thank you, and thank you for the photo. It's wonderful to see it here.
And you also write about your great-grandmother, so that would have been Nancy Belgrave's granddaughter, is that right?
Yes.
Fanny Miller Williams, and her work and activism. Tell us about her.
So Fanny Miller Williams is also born in Danville, educated at Berea College in the years that was a mixed race institution at the end of the 19th century in Kentucky. By 1920, she settled in St. Louis, Missouri. She herself has been an educator, and her husband, Frank Williams, is a school principal. But by 1919, Fanny is very well aware that the 19th Amendment appears to be coming down the pike. And she's also aware that Black women are going to face a very distinct set of hurdles before they are able to register. They are going to face poll taxes, literacy tests, understanding clauses, grandfather clauses. And with her allies in the Phyllis Wheatley branch of the YWCA in St. Louis, Fanny opens a suffrage school. And this is a very close to the ground effort that is not unique to St. Louis at all, but we find it in many, many towns and cities across the United States, Black women who are deliberately preparing one another to confront the kind of hurdles that are already keeping their sons, their fathers, their husbands from the ballot box. If the newspaper accounts are anywhere near correct, it's said that every woman in St. Louis registered in 1920. Why is that important to us? Well, that's phenomenal in and of itself. Right. But it means that Black women like Fanny were indeed able to register out of this very important collective effort to citizenship education, defeating, if you will, the structure of Jim Crow that intended to keep Black women from the polls. And so I was excited to find her there as a sort of suffragist, doing that work alongside, caring for her family and much more.
Wow. You mentioned this a little bit earlier during your introduction about the work that so many other historians had done into African-American women's political history. Talk to us about how you were able to kind of go back through the work that had been done, but hadn't really been compiled into one place. And you write in the introduction of your book, and you refer to this, six volume history of women's suffrage, right? That written by Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Matilda Gage and Ida Harper, only told one part of the story and really relegated Black women to the margins of history. Talk to us about what sort of research had been done already, how you put that all together, and then the research that you were able to do as well. I just think it's fascinating how you were able to pull all this together and weave such a terrific narrative throughout the book.
Yeah. For a very long time, this 6 volumes, really just by virtue of their heft, if you will, might have left the impression that Stanton, Anthony et al. Had written a comprehensive, exhaustive history.
Right.
But it takes some deliberate critical thinking and then some very deliberate research in order to disclose, if you will, that this is a history that tells one important thread of the story, privileges the activism, the ideas of a subset of women, including the authors, but doesn't tell us everything we might know about the history of women's struggles for the votes. Credit must go to the late Dr. Rosalind Terborg Penn, who in her doctoral dissertation published in the 1970s, and then later her wonderful monographic study in the 1990s, Dr. Terborg Penn was among the very first and certainly the most sustained scholar to come back to this volume, to some degree to find the Black women in it who had not been identified or distinguished as such by the authors, but then to build out from those women a much broader history of how Black women thought about, acted on, and engaged with the problem of their political rights. You know, one of the conclusions that some historians had drawn from the history of women's suffrage was that the relative absence of Black women reflected Black women's disinterest in politics and in voting rights. So that, and let us just say, right, drawing an inference from an absence is a very, very challenging and trepidatious enterprise. But Dr. Terborg Penn doesn't take that conclusion at face value. And once she, if you will, cracks the code on these volumes and publishes her book, it really becomes a guide, a template. If I was able to build on her work at all, it was because I understood from her that if we really wanted to find the history of African American women and voting rights, we would have to go beyond those organizations that called themselves suffrage associations, right? That there were too few Black women there, even when we found all of those, right, who had been affiliated. And so part of my question in the research was, where were Black women? And what were they doing? What were they saying? And it turns out when we visit the records of Black churches or anti-slavery societies, of women's clubs, of civil rights organizations, and more, we find women, Black women, talking about rights, including political rights and including the vote. We see them deeply concerned and engaged with the question of not only equality, but dignity. And so my work is very much finds Black women and finds the history of suffrage, if you will, in perhaps for some readers, I think, unexpected places.
Yeah. You write about several Black women who, you say, quote, were lighting the fires for suffrage and equality 2 centuries ago. Tell us, I want to go through, some of these stories that you have in there. Tell us about Jarena Lee.
Jarena Lee, yeah.
And her leadership that began really in the church. And she had to fight for actually her right to preach.
Yeah. So as I said, I go looking for the core of what I take to be Black women's political critique, right? Almost their political philosophy, which is the view that neither race nor sex should have any role in arbitrating political power, access to the political process, including the ballot, and more. Well, where does that? And that's a very I think 21st century sounding idea to some ears. Sometimes it's referred to as an intersectional view. But it turns out Black women have been talking through that vision, working through that vision for 200 years. And Jarena Lee is one of our wonderful examples of just that. She is, as a young woman, believes herself called to preach, and yet finds herself stymied when she is told that women in her denomination, she's a Methodist, a Black Methodist, are not eligible for preaching licenses. Women aren't suited to preaching. Lee tries to wedge herself into the limits, but fails, and not only makes a record as a very effective preacher, a profoundly effective preacher, she makes an innovation in a compromise with the head bishop of her denomination that she will get a license, wink, wink, and be able to preach. But more importantly, or perhaps for us, most importantly, in 1836, she pens a spiritual memoir and leaves us a record of what it was like to be a Black preaching woman in the early decades of the 19th century. And in that, she is forceful in her claim that gender should have no place in arbitrating who preaches the gospel. And her example inspires a next generation of Black women Methodists who will really take that question in hand, petition formally for women's preaching licenses and win them. And these stories are so important because they show us that Black women are indeed, though they're not at Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, participating in the production of a Declaration of Sentiments there. They are in 1848 in Black Methodist churches and speaking, if you will, much the same language that's being spoken in Seneca Falls.
Yeah, and the leadership really starting there in the churches. Fast forwarding to the political culture right before 1920. So by 1913, you write about the two-pronged approach, of course, for the campaign for the 19th Amendment. Alice Paul, Carrie Chapman Catt, at the helm of two very different approaches. Where were the Black women in this configuration?
Black women are politically organized. Some of them in suffrage associations, many, many more of them in church associations, mm-hmm. Black Baptist and Methodist women, and then still hundreds of thousands of others organized through the National Association of Colored Women, which is probably the best analog to the National American Women's Suffrage Association and later the National Women's Party. So Black women are engaged, mobilized around the 19th Amendment, and at the same time, they are not single issue activists at all. And the National Association of Colored Women, for example, is as committed to, as engaged with winning federal anti-lynching legislation as it is engaged with winning a 19th Amendment. And this is why Black women are, I think, less drawn to suffrage associations, which by the time we are on the road, quite literally, to the 19th Amendment, have openly declined to engage with the problem of racism, racial violence, Jim Crow. Those are issues said to be outside of the purview of suffrage associations. And this is an awkward, at best, right, an awkward fit for African-American women. At the same time, NASA and the National Women's Party have developed a strategy for winning the 19th Amendment that is rooted to an important degree in collusion with, cooperation with, and accommodation to white supremacy. The view is from that position that African-American women are a liability because the prospect of enfranchising them will lead many, many male lawmakers to withhold their support for the 19th Amendment, particularly in the American South. And so the national organizations are going to jettison the interests of Black women, and to an important degree, they're going to jettison Black women in a strategy that seeks to win the support of Southern lawmakers. And if anyone has read Elaine Weiss's wonderful book, right, The Woman's Hour, about 1920 and the campaign in Tennessee, as Elaine explains, that the Tennessee ratification of the 19th Amendment in Tennessee is only possible because lawmakers there believe that nothing in the 19th Amendment will prohibit them from disenfranchising African-American women going forward.
Right. And then the culture after the 19th Amendment was passed, between 1920 and sort of the modern civil rights movement, that period, you say, is often forgotten really in the history of Black women in politics. Give us a sense of what the political culture looked like, and how someone like Mary McLeod Bethune, who you write about, became a powerful figure despite disenfranchisement.
Yeah, it's important to say there are Black women who vote even before 1920
Right.
in California, in Illinois, in New York. Ida B. Wells's organization, the Alpha Suffrage Club, will in the 1920s be in the trenches of electoral politics and help to propel Oscar de Priest, the first Black man to sit in Congress since Reconstruction. They will propel de Priest, right, into Washington. So that is going on. But for many other Black women, there is this is a difficult era of now disenfranchisement. And Bethune, who had been in the trenches in Florida in 1919 and 1920, registering Black women, attempting to get them to the polls. By 1922, certainly Bethune knows that unchecked violence in Florida is going to keep Black Americans, including Black women, to an important degree, to a devastating degree, away from the polls, despite the 19th Amendment. But Bethune does not then sit down and wait for a Voting Rights Act 45 years later.
Right.
She comes to Washington by the 1930s. She'll organize under the umbrella of the National Conference of Negro Women. And most importantly for our story, will win the alliance of Franklin Roosevelt, help Roosevelt to establish his Black cabinet. And Bethune will use the combination of lobbying and patronage and friendship, political friendship, allyship, to bring not only herself, but scores of other Black women and men to the New Deal agencies that are now meting out resources. Bethune understands that if you can win a presidential appointment, which are numerous now with the New Deal agencies,
Right.
one doesn't have to be able to cast a ballot herself. One does not have to be on a ballot to wield power in Washington. And this is part of Bethune's brilliance. Yes, she remains committed to voting rights, and at the same time, she's not going to wait for them. And she does essential work for Black communities that are in danger of being left behind by the New Deal. Bethune is critical in making sure those resources get where they need to go.
You mentioned Oscar de Priest a few minutes ago, the African-American member of Congress. And you write in the book about nothing being easy about being a Black woman in Washington during the 1920s. And you tell the story of his wife, Jessie de Priest, and what happened when she was invited to the White House in June of 1929 by Mrs. Hoover.
Right. So here is Oscar de Priest has been elected now. His wife, Jessie de Priest, accompanies him to Washington. And yes, Mrs. Hoover is planning a series of ritual teas to welcome the wives of lawmakers to Washington and to the White House. And she is at best awkward and at worst vexed about the prospect of including Mrs. de Priest. The Hoover administration itself has important relationships and relies upon their relationships with Southern members of Congress. And so there is a political concern about not alienating those allies in the House and in the Senate. And there is a social rights question about a city that has become segregated since the Wilson years, and whether or not white lawmakers' wives will come to a tea if Mrs. de Priest is included. What I love about this story is that while there is a great deal of wrangling and strife that goes on behind the scenes, when Mrs. de Priest comes back to Chicago, she really, in her remarks, and she speaks before a public gathering of Black women who have come to hear about this incident. And part of what she says is, those women are just like us, right? There's nothing, right? They have nothing on us, right? And it is, I think, a subtle but strong sense of that a woman like Jessie DePriest is profoundly familiar with anti-Black racism, as the wife of a public figure, as an activist herself in Chicago. She is not a naive woman. She's not an unsophisticated woman. She's not someone who would condone anti-Black racism, but she is not going to, if you will, give over, right, the whole of her persona or the role that the priests aim to play in Washington. She's not going to give that over wholly to the behind the scenes tensions when it comes to a White House tea. To the contrary, she reassures everybody it was just fine. I'm just fine.
And this was the clip, I found this on the White House Historical Society website from an Ohio paper that talking about the visit to the White House. And it says the social recognition of Mrs. Oscar DePriest at the White House has dimmed the Hoover popularity in the South. Southern congressmen, generally Republicans as well as Democrats, think that the president and Mrs. Hoover have made a great and irreparable mistake. And that's what they're up against.
Mm-hmm. And I think, but if we look at what Mrs. DePriest says, she says, "Oh, forget it. Let's not make too much of that."
Exactly. You also tell the story of Nanny Helen Burroughs and her commitment to interracial cooperation in activism. Can you tell us a little bit more about her?
Sure. One of the things I was curious about was how, if at all, Black and white women, if you will, sort of reset the terms of their alliances after these, I think by all accounts, sort of terribly, fraught, racist-laden episodes in the winning of the 19th Amendment. How on earth do Black and white women ever make alliances again? Do they make alliances again? And Nanny Helen Burroughs, whose work I had known, of course, from the important history, Righteous Discontent, from Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, Dr. Higginbotham at Harvard. But when I followed Burroughs' story, she does indeed re-enter, if you will, into alliances with white women in politics through the interracial cooperation movement. And this is a movement that quite deliberately, as it looks to chart the future of Southern society, as it looks to and recognizes the degree to which Jim Crow is not only a burden, it is a handicap for Southern society. Interracial cooperation, its premise is to bring together Black and white Southerners around a table on equal terms. And for Burroughs, this is a moving encounter because she genuinely experiences her first interracial cooperation gathering as one in which she is recognized, she is heard, her voice has force and consequence. And she is not alone in this period in looking to broker a new, not only a rapport, right, but really the new terms of how Black and white women will together with Black and white men, I should say, in this movement, work through terms of parity, rather through the kind of crude hierarchies that animated the suffrage associations. And this really does permit Black and white women to work together in important ways. This will help Burroughs, for example, to work, if you will, across the color line, even in the Baptist church, and engage in projects that she shares with white Baptist women.
You also write in the acknowledgments of the book that you're often asked about your favorite Black suffragists. You typically don't like to choose favorites, but you do say that no figure really looms larger than Ida B. Wells.
Yeah, Ida Wells is all that. The educator, journalist, social scientist, anti-lynching leader, international figure, suffragist, and much more. Wells was, I think, there's no better example than Wells of the kind of political identities and the sorts of political approaches to politics that Black women take up, particularly the end of the 19th and into the 20th century. Wells had a sharp tongue and a sharp pen, and her forthrightness won her critics. Her forthrightness put her in harm's way, but her model was an essential one for emboldening Black women in the era of Jim Crow, in the midst of the rise of violence, in the midst of disfranchisement, the imposition of segregation. Wells is someone who really insists for herself, but I think insists for Black women more generally, that the necessity for their politics, the necessity for their power is all the more great as Black Americans generally face a new set of extraordinary handicaps. Wells is someone who I'm hardly alone in valorizing Ida Wells. She is someone who has, I think, rightfully won a great deal of recognition, including most recently a posthumous recognition by the Pulitzer Prize Committee, a tribute to the ways in which, I call this book Vanguard because my conclusion after an immersion not only in Wells's life work, but the life work of so many of the women in this book, was about the ways in which they were pointing us, leading us, urging us as a nation, not just Black women, not just Black Americans, right? The nation as a whole, right? To understand and to achieve its best ideals. And I think there's nobody who exemplifies that more than Ida Wells.
We do have some questions, so I want to
Wonderful
time. And please, if you have any more questions, please send them in and ask the question tab on the bottom. But let me start with Jessica, who asked if you could speak more about the importance of Kamala Harris's nomination as VP and what you think this moment in political history says to young Black girls.
Thank you. Well, that last piece is worth underscoring. Right. I'm someone who's comfortable saying that whatever Senator Harris's fate might be in November, her nomination, her candidacy already is contributing to the transformation of girls and young women, the next generations of activists, of political leaders and more are taking their example. And the ceiling, right, is the bar is higher, right, is all the more high. So I think that's important. But what I think it's important to say about Senator Harris is that I think it might be time to sort of curb our impulse to valorize her as only the first. Turns out she's not the first Black woman to be nominated as vice president. That honor, that distinction goes to Charlotta Bass, who in 1952 ran for vice president on the Progressive Party ticket out of California. But more to the point, Black women today in American politics are a force. No longer are they first. And Senator Harris is going to run alongside some 120, 130 Black women who are vying for seats just in Congress alone. And then if we look to state and local contests, hundreds upon hundreds of Black women running for office. And that is really, for me, what is important to underscore about this season. that Black women have prepared for this moment, which meant that when the Democrats were putting together a long, short list, there were 6 Black women on this list, because Black women have been preparing for this season and the opening, right? That was the Biden candidacy, and they come as a force. So whatever her fate, we are sure to see many, many record numbers of Black women on the ballots this fall, and I suspect record numbers of them elected. And as a constituency, right, they are not going anywhere, whatever Senator Harris's fate might be.
Right. Well, to that point, we have another question from Caitlin, who says that Black women are considered the cornerstone of the Democratic Party. How can the party and party officials be better about acknowledging their impact?
Well, I think the first way to, from my view, the first way to acknowledge Black women's impact is to understand them better, study them better, and to follow their lead. Because part of what we know about Black women is not only are they loyal to the party, though I think that that's a troubling term for me, frankly, because who Black women are discerning, active, engaged, deliberating political beings who, through a very complex process, oftentimes close to the ground, do vote as a bloc at the polls. But the key really about Black women is that they not only vote as a bloc, they turn out oftentimes disproportionately to other parts of the electorate. And for a party that I think has a stake in turnout, understanding how Black women organize, mobilize, get one another informed, get one another inspired, and literally get one another ballot in hand, the casting of ballot by whatever means, holds, I think, lessons for the party, right, in how to do the groundwork that is essential. And will be, I think, critical in 2020, but is important in any year. So the first honor I think you can do is to pay attention and to let Black women teach us how to do the work. If you're a Democrat, how to teach us as a party how to do that work.
Great. Here's a good question from Leah, who wants to see if you could talk some more about the challenges that literacy tests brought, back, and, literacy tests, poll tests, grandfather clause, all of that, back after the 19th Amendment was passed. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So this is voter suppression a la 1920.
Right.
And poll taxes, $1, $2, in some jurisdictions, $3, that must be paid months and months before Election Day if one wants to cast a ballot. What does that mean? How does that work? Well, it means that indeed you have to have the cash. And for example, Southern sharecroppers who work in a non-cash economy, $1, $2, $3 6 months before an election is an extraordinary expenditure of very, very slim cash reserves, if any, in a household. So a tough choice, right? What to do with do you pay your poll tax? Do you pay your medical bill? These are the hard choices. Literacy tests, administered with a great deal of discretion by local officials. One might be asked to read a primer from, elementary school, or one might be asked to read a section of the U.S. Constitution. And along with that, one might be asked to then demonstrate her understanding by interpreting that section of the Constitution. Now, I'll confess, I think I'm one, as many times as I have taught the Constitution, if you asked me to explain the Electoral College, I would probably get it wrong. And I certainly would get it wrong in the eyes of a voting official who was looking to keep me from the polls. Grandfather clauses. These are if you will, the escape valve that ensures that white voters are not unduly impacted by literacy tests. So you can be excused from a literacy test if your grandfather voted before, say, 1867 or 1868. Well, that doesn't say no black person can vote, but what we know is that in the American South, many, if not most, Black Americans are descended from enslaved people who could not vote categorically before 1868. And as a consequence, grandfather clauses permit some people to avoid literacy tests and understanding clauses and trap other people in the vice of disfranchisement.
Great. Let's see. A couple more questions here. This goes to some of the points you were making earlier, and obviously I think it's probably the rationale for the book, but one of the questions is, how can we begin understanding and acknowledging the role that Black women in serving as barrier breakers in political society? Names such as Ida B. Wells are known, but her impact is not fully appreciated or understood, particularly in our current political system.
Yeah, well, I think, in some ways, I'm a history teacher, and I could lament all evening about what doesn't and what doesn't happen in our classrooms, and at the same time acknowledge the ways in which educators are under extraordinary pressures, whether it's teaching to tests or grappling with standardized curricula or prescribed textbooks. I spend a good amount of my time talking with and training K through 12 educators. That is one way that we begin to shift the narrative and together discover ways in which someone like Ida B. Wells can come in a compatible way, even on a very crowded curriculum. So I think there's a whole story there about that. And on the other hand, I'll say thank you to Senator Harris, who I don't know at all, but who during her acceptance speech at the Democratic Convention just a couple of weeks ago was explicit about the political history out of which she has emerged, naming names like Ida Wells and Mary Church Terrell, Mary McLeod Bethune, Shirley Chisholm. And so another important, and the way I end Vanguard is in fact looking at the ways in which some Black women leaders of the 21st century, when queried, know this history or know an important portion of it, are eager to explain the political history, the political traditions, the inspirations, the mentorship, and more that has led them to this. Barbara Lee from California in Congress, her very first experience in American politics was volunteering in Shirley Chisholm's 1972 run for the presidency, the Democratic nomination. And Val Demings from Florida credits Mary McLeod Bethune and Mary McLeod Bethune's example. It's a little bit like my answer to the earlier question, that if we actually listen to Black women and we are curious and engaged, those in our midst will tell us precisely who we need to know and what we need to know about our own history. So I've written a book that attempts to bring a lot of that together in a I hope engaging and convenient read. But the reason to do that is because someone like a Val Demings or a Barbara Lee or a Kamala Harris is already saying to us, if you want to understand what I bring to the table and how I got here, it won't be enough to be familiar with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan Anthony and their history of women's suffrage. There's a different sort of history that will explain not only how we got here, but explains the texture of the political tradition out of Black women come. It's no mistake that Kamala Harris just weeks ago is on the floor of the Senate along with Cory Booker from New Jersey, seeing through the work that Ida Wells began more than a century before. They're still working on that federal anti-lynching legislation, working very deliberately in that tradition. That's not an accident.
Right.
That is by design.
Let's see, a question from Mimi, who's I see also asking in the chat if this the Women on Wednesday series is available to watch previous events. And I just want to let everybody know that if you go up to the top of your screen where it says Women in Politics Institute, if you click on that, you should be able to follow us, and you can go to our page here and see all of our Women on Wednesdays in one place, or you can land on our website, just Google Women in Politics Institute, and they are all there, and links to them on YouTube as well. But her other question is, she's asking for the follow-up on Nanny Helen Burroughs. She says, please speak more about her strategies to cross the color line and the implications to Kamala Harris.
Sure. So Burroughs, I think, doesn't begin her career as someone who aims to cross the color line at all.
Yeah.
In fact, she is on the ground with the founding of the Black Women's Congress, the Black Baptist Women's Congress, and many of the women I write about are not only content, but are called and are deeply satisfied by that work, even it is framed by the scourge of Jim Crow. So I don't think Burroughs really sets out to cross the color line, but she will, if you will, by invitation and by suggestion when the proposal is the right one. And that's why I think the focus on interracial cooperation is important. That Black women study this movement, they help to give birth to it and define its terms, such that when someone like Burroughs encounters it, she's intrigued. It doesn't look like the kind of fraught, unequal, racist-laden encounters that certainly she and her mentors knew in the years before 1920. It doesn't even look like the strife between Black and white Baptists and the rifts between Black and white Baptists. It looks like something very different. But it's important to say that Burroughs never abandons her leadership, both her school in Washington, D.C., and her leadership among Black Baptist women, millions of Black Baptist women who are organized and work under this umbrella. She never abandons that for interracial cooperation. I don't think crossing the color line is a goal. Crossing the color line may, in some cases, turn out to be an important strategy. It may be a way to build alliances, but it doesn't present, for at least the women I write about, a wholesale alternative to the work that they have been doing in the organizations that they have been building in Black communities for a very long time.
Let's see, Isabel has a question. She says, are you hopeful about Black women's leadership in today's Black Lives Matter movement and other social justice movements? Or are you worried about the prospect of Black women carrying the heavy burden of sustained activism on behalf of people of color and equity for all?
Yeah. That's a difficult equation, isn't it? That's a really difficult equation. So I appreciate the question for acknowledging the foundational role that Black women have played in the movement for Black lives and continue to play in the movement for Black lives. And at the same time, I think your point is an important one. And it's one of my reflections about the women in Vanguard. You know, there's nothing envious about being those voices in American politics that insist on our best ideals There's nothing envious about holding up a bar very high, only to have people ignore it, turn away, reject it, and more. That is not an envious place to be. It's not an envious place for Black women to be. And I think we're hearing, because Black women are hardly a monolith, there is a great deal of pushback against the notion, right, that Black women are going to carry any particular candidate, any particular party, any particular political movement. I hear a lot of no to that also. I think here we are in a moment where part of what it means to listen to Black women, to honor their contributions and the role they play in political culture, is also to understand the no. And the no is in part a way to say, is to pose a question. How are we going to allocate and reallocate our commitment to these ideals, and then do the work that it takes to arrive there?
Well, that's the perfect ending note, Martha. Thank you so much for this book and this contribution to history, and really appreciate you coming tonight and sharing it with us. I want to let everybody know that we have some upcoming events that you are invited to over the next few Wednesdays. We're going to have one more event on women's suffrage next Wednesday with Lynn Scher and Ellen Goodman, who are two journalists that have a podcast called She Votes. So they will be here to talk about that next Wednesday, and then the Wednesday after that, we're going to talk about women in sort of the condition of COVID, and talk to Kristen Kim Bart from the International Rescue Committee. And there's a new report they have out called "When Returning to Normal Doesn't Work for Half of the World's Population." And so we will talk about that report. And then the Wednesday after that, we have former Congresswoman Katie Hill, who will be here with her new book, She Will Rise, and that'll be on September 23rd. So we hope folks can join us for that, and you can just hit our Crowdcast page and register for any of those events. So with that, again, thank you, Martha. Really appreciate it. And congratulations on the book. I hope everyone has a chance to read it. And
thank you.
So glad that you could be here tonight with us.
Thank you so much, Betsy. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.